Hi, welcome to our talk. We'll be covering how remakes and remasters are created from an art direction and design standpoint. I'm Boti Harko, art director at Roommate Studio, and I've been creating game art for the better part of the last 15 years for studios such as Activision Blizzard, King, and GameLoft.
Hey, I'm Hunter Wright, Associate Game Director at Dragon's Lake. I've also been in the industry about 15 years, working on all manner of design roles at a number of different studios, including Playground Games, Starbreeze, and Gearbox.
Now, the process of remastering isn't as straightforward as you would expect, but it's a much needed step in the gaming world. That's why we're having this talk. So, to start off, let's roll back time a bit and let's dive into some well established games. For example, I loved playing Resident Evil and Silent Hill on the PlayStation as a kid. It looks like I was a fan of horror games. Still am. As I think back to them with rose tinted glasses, I remember them having the best graphics, but time hasn't been kind to them, and they don't seem to be holding up that well. And that's why we're seeing such a reemergence of remasters of our childhood games today, because now those stories can be told more easily, sometimes even better. This is simply because we have more tools at our disposal. The barrier to entry is lower to achieve the great visuals. Tools have become much more intuitive and easy to learn. Graphics power has increased a hundredfold. Visual storytelling has evolved to cinematic levels, and nowadays, more than ever, we rely on visuals, especially compared to text or heavily limited graphics back in the day. That's even why they had the fog in Silent Hill, because the render distance was just so limiting on the PS1. They played to their strength and added it as an air of mystery. Nowadays, we can do so much more to retell these stories. So as you could see, in 2023, there was a flood of remasters coming in, and 2024 isn't showing any signs of stopping. And Hunter can explain why that's happening.
So, why is this becoming more common? Games are more expensive than ever in an industry that's more competitive than ever. And so publishers have a lot lower appetite for risk and are relying a lot more on easily recognizable, very well established IPs. On top of that, time spent playing games in 2023 was over 60% of that time was on live service games that were at least 6 years old. So, these are big titles like Minecraft, Fortnite, and Apex Legends that capture players' attention and make it even harder for new games to stand out. And this is likely going to remain the case for years to come. So to play it safe, a really good strategy is to give people what you know that they already like. This isn't the easiest thing, however, which is the main reason we're having this talk. There's a number of things that you need to balance when trying to make a successful remake. Since you're often chasing the player's memory of when they originally played the game, you have to walk a very fine line between originality and then, modern design principles and graphics. Ideally, you want to renew interest and breathe new life into the series while adapting it to modern user preferences and modern technologies.
Now, to clarify what art direction means in a remaster, or in general, it's simply defining the visual standard based on a visual target, like how your game is intended to look like. This happens at the beginning of development as a result of planning across multiple divisions: 2D, 3D, technical art, animation, VFX, lighting, game design, programming. And we design what's achievable within the production timeline and technical possibilities. The art director is the holder of this vision and planning. And after that, he or she makes sure that all visuals created during production are matching the same style and quality. Now, why we need a remake with improved art direction? Well, we simply can use so much more detail within the environment, and this adds to the experience and helps the immersion. Or maybe the art direction couldn't be fleshed out in the original because of technical limitations. If you couldn't express it visually, there just wasn't room for it. Lighting has opened up new roles. We have lighting artists who can relight the shot in cinematics, for example, for better readability or to guide the player during gameplay. Framing and cinematics have really come a long way. We can employ camera tricks used in feature film. We can use those tropes to tell the story so much better because we're used to that kind of conveyance of the story.
And then, similar to the art side, the expected gameplay and user experience of a game can really change drastically over the years since the original release. And there are a number of ways that a remake can make sure that the game is comfortable and appealing for new players and existing fans at the same time. Since we're really trying to appeal to as many people as possible, we want to make sure that there's something in the remake for everyone. Naturally, some people playing it will be lifelong fans of the game, but others may be very new to the experience. They might have missed it the first time around, and you want to make sure they're able to hop in and play without knowing anything about the existing work. But at the same time, providing all the established things that the longtime fans are going to expect. Some good examples are, we hear often about how hard or how difficult old school games can be, which can be very off putting to a number of people. So you can focus on adding accessibility to the game mechanics to allow a wider range of people to play and enjoy the game. But you shouldn't underestimate the amount of time that can be taken up by implementing these features. A lot of them are, very easy to do, but a lot of them can have very wide-ranging implications across, a number of game mechanics. Additionally, with the shift to digital storefronts, we're seeing more and more titles get delisted for any number of reasons. And having a remaster means that your game is available to purchase regardless of the status of the original game. This can also be a great gauge on seeing how much interest the market has for a new entry in your series based on how well your remaster does. So we looked at the numbers, and after looking at almost 700 remakes and re-releases, we found out that the average time to remake a game is about 13 years. Average time for remasters is about 0 to 5 years, and full-on remakes is about 11 to 15. When you have such a big gap in the time since the original release, there's a couple of big questions that you want to tackle. Chief among them is if you should change the engine of the game or not. Many remakes choose to make the game in Unreal or Unity, but this can be a bit of a double-edged sword. It's very easy to update the visuals and to make it run on modern platforms, and you have a vast talent pool of people that can work with those engines. But if you do change the engine, you have to make sure that you absolutely nail the game feel and core player experience that people had when they played the original game. Things like game feel are a lot easier to preserve when you stay with the original engine, but then you have to do a lot of work to make sure that that original engine is up to the task of running on modern hardware and accepting all of these new visual improvements and design improvements. There's also a bit of a hybrid approach that games like Halo Combat Evolved Anniversary took, where they have a modern graphics engine running on top of the original engine for like gameplay and physics. This does give a bit of the best of both worlds, but is very complex and expensive to do and can result in a lot of errors that you have to spend time tracking down and fixing.
Now, for the detailing part, we have to understand two things. First of all, was the original hindered by technical limitations? This almost exclusively is always the case, but as a counter-argument, it can be the case that the game was initially stylistically planned for the hardware's limitations, and this was an aesthetic choice. As an example, The Legend of Zelda: The Wind Waker, the remaster came out 10 years after the original, and the improvements are negligible because the art direction was well thought out in the first place. It stood the test of time, the game looks the same, plays the same, because there wasn't much to improve. The second thing is, does adding more detail add more value to your game? We get back to the rose-tinted analogy of how we remember things versus how they really were. So the example for that would be Dead Space. Originally it released in 2008, and then it got remastered in 2023. Those of us who've played it, we remember it looking exactly like the 2023 version, until we see a screenshot from the original and realize how far we've actually come. There's a saying that bad design is everywhere and good design is invisible. This is what we have to do. So retell the story without losing the essence. The Dead Space remaster preserves the original art direction and details out what could only be implied originally because of the technical limitations. Our brain used to fill in the gaps anyway the first time around, but now we see the actual detail.
And we always want to make the best game that we can, but making wholesale changes to the story or core mechanics can really alienate fans. So you want to pick and choose those improvements very carefully. There are some like very universal things like clunky controls or dated mechanics that can be smoothed out without sacrificing what the core gameplay of the game is. And additionally, small like quality of life improvements like modern menus and UI and autosaves can be really relatively easy to implement while also helping the game feel modern and new and still not touching that core experience. You can also consider allowing the player to switch back and forth between different options in real time. I really enjoyed this in games like R-Type Dimensions and Wonder Boy: The Dragon's Trap. You're able to change between the original and updated graphics at the press of a button just to see how far we've come in real time.
And the same thing can be said about the Diablo 2 remaster. Now, I've mentioned the Resident Evil series before. So the original story was great. It was a trailblazer 28 years ago, and it defined a new genre. It felt like a B movie that was also a horror movie that you could actually play. But the visuals were just not holding up. There have been some remasters of it, either as ports for different platforms or remasters with a focus on preserving the originals. Well, they were just focusing on preserving it one-to-one with some graphical upgrades. So higher resolution renders of the environment, refined character models, but the fixed camera and everything else stayed the same. So this would be considered a standard remaster, just like in a movie remaster. It's the same image, but sharper. The latest installment, though, namely Resident Evil 2 and 3, have knocked it out of the park. So let me get you into context on that. The art direction in the original was purely functional. A fully 3D environment wasn't really possible on PS1, as I said about Silent Hill as well. So they pre-rendered the backgrounds as a static image and placed the 3D character over that. So whenever you walked outside the camera's field of view, you got the adjacent rendered background. It was fluid enough to make the experience playable. When it came to redoing Resident Evil, the gaming landscape has shifted to the first and third person views, and also almost exclusively nowadays. The now constant is the story and the characters. Everything else receives creative freedom. Now, we got full liberty of exploring the environment, so the lighting, placing of elements throughout the scene, they have to be strategic in guiding the player. So only showing enough to keep the player guessing what's around the corner and keeps that level of tension that the original had. The IP itself always had a cinematic flair to it, but now the story could be told with the grace of a movie director.
And on the design side, the new Resident Evil games do a great job of modernizing the gameplay while preserving kind of the essence of the game. As Bodhi said, fixed camera angles are gone from the newer remasters, which might put off some fans, but having full 3D movements is the default now, so that's what most fans are going to expect in a modern game. To help kind of ease this transition, Resident Evil games offer a number of different control schemes, kind of let the player decide how much they want to embrace this new gameplay style versus try to relive some of the old school facets of the original game. But similarly, new combat mechanics and redesigned boss battles really give the game a more modern feel, which kind of works in concert with the change away from the original gameplay conventions like the camera angles and the overall just difficulty of the game. Another great example of an improvement is how they handled these sections where you have to escort Ashley in Resident Evil 4. She's now just kind of better at moving around the scene in general. And in addition to this, has a newly designed health bar and system where she goes down instead of dying. This makes the game far less punishing during these sections and brings it in line with what players are going to expect in modern games. But even small things like little tweaks to layouts of levels to kind of smooth pacing can really go a long way to make sure that you're presenting the game as the player remembers it instead of how it actually was.
In the same vein, let's see Final Fantasy VII. So it originally came out in 1997 and the remaster came in 2020. Now this installment is the most beloved in the series. And as the devs have been working on fleshing out the game's universe along the years, more and more of the gaps got filled in. The architecture is more solidified, the character design has matured, their backstories have been expanded, they got fleshed out to the fullest. And they actually went for a realistic style more recently. They kept the signature outfits and landmark elements so they're recognizable without feeling out of place, even in a realistic setting. The art direction itself for the IP is more than 37 years in the making. There's a well documented underlying universe that describes all facets of the world, and this makes it easy to add to or reinterpret any segment of it. With the world building in place, the studio could step away from just a one-to-one reproduction, as long as they respect the source material. Now, this is a great example of strategic planning that spans multiple game releases. First, they created an in-house engine to handle new game frameworks. It's also a generational shift in art style. It's more realistic and detailed. Characters have more nuance. They're more expressive. The environment feels more believable and tangible. Then they focused on new gameplay systems, and after which they released Final Fantasy XV. And it worked out great. So much so that they retrofitted it to Final Fantasy VII as a retelling of the original story.
Yeah, so the new Final Fantasy VII does a great job at recapturing the spirit of the original while making it very appealing to modern audiences. As Bodhi mentioned, they're able to take advantage of the work that they had done in recent Final Fantasy games and just directly map that gameplay experience onto the story of Final Fantasy VII while preserving kind of the overall vibe and feel of that game that everyone loves so much. The switch from classic turn-based, combat to real-time action gameplay really deepens the engagement that players have with the gameplay systems. I remember playing the original game, and after so many hours, I would get to where, I was just doing the same 2 or 3 spells over and over again to kind of grind through the combats. But now with real-time combat abilities like the new stagger mechanic, it really creates a very dynamic combat loop that really encourages the player to use all of their abilities. There's also a number of other features that were very commonplace when Final Fantasy VII first released, such as randomized encounters that have gotten replaced with more modern things like being able to see enemies on the map as you're exploring the world. This gives the player, the choice of if they want to engage with the enemies or try to avoid them, and it's just more in line with modern gaming.
Now, onto the bad part of remakes. There will always be badly optimized games. It all comes down to the development team's capabilities and ambitions and proper planning. Sometimes there are layers of complexity under the hood that you can't account for. As Hunter mentioned previously in the Halo remake, technical complexity adds a lot of variables that can break your game, especially if you're running multiple builds, one on top of the other. Sometimes you don't understand the source material well enough, or your target audience, or you're creating something entirely different. As luck would have it, the more detail you bring to something, the more the scrutiny. Just need to have a good understanding of the subject matter you're trying to restore and the skill sets to be on par with that.
And as we've said previously, keeping the core experience is key with remakes, and you really need to identify what makes your game unique. Bodhi mentioned Silent Hill previously in the presentation, which is really known for its imposing fog, which was a hardware constraint at the time. And even though we have the technical ability to make the game without the fog today, that fog is really what makes Silent Hill's atmosphere and gameplay work so well. So, you really want to closely analyze what you're wanting to add or remove to your game before you make, big changes like that. And as always, you have to make sure that you tackle bugs before release, especially since people have had previous exposure to these games. Bugs are going to be perceived very critically.
As it happens, we've worked on a couple of remasters ourselves, and we've garnered a lot of experience along the years. And from this, we've learned that you have to attune to what made the original special and not lose that essence in the process. You also have to have a good understanding of the player base and where it is nowadays. A good collaboration between an IP holder and external partner starts with a simple question. Is what we bring to the table doing the original team's work justice? One of the main draws to these IPs is the stories felt more intricate. The development teams were forced to focus on originality in gameplay and storytelling, for the simple fact that the graphics just weren't permissive enough to let them break the mold otherwise. But nowadays, we have the technical means to bring the visuals up to par and the gaming experience to match the current landscape. So in closing, same as classic books get reprinted every so often, this is what we do in this medium. The story stays the same, but we're updating its appearance and sometimes the way we interact with it. So it looks like the other books on the shelf and appeals to younger audiences, and also brings back those who've already experienced them. And that brings us to the end of our talk. Thank you for coming and listening. And if you have any questions or want to talk, you can reach us via the channels provided by Nordic.
Thank you so much for listening.